Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And we are going to get started momentarily. I want to just share one more thing, sort of the nuts and bolts before we get into it. If you haven't introduced yourself, I would encourage you to do so now in the chat. So let us know who you are, where you're from, and the most fun thing that you've done over the last month. The chat is really the comment section of the YouTube Live. And that's how we will use this chat. That's how we're going to chat. And that's how you can submit questions, comments. Like, you can feel free if you have a thought or an idea, or it's something that we say really resonates with you, feel free to drop a comment there, so that there's conversation going on amongst the people who are here, as well as we're doing this. And the last thing that I'll say, and I mentioned this earlier, but for those people who are just coming on, the chat does not get saved long-term. So when people come back to watch this, this live later, once we, do the editing of it, it's not going to be available to everyone. And so all of the things that you're chatting here there won't be a record of that forever. So awesome. Cool. I see Lucy, Kathy, Charlotte. Awesome. So glad that you all are here. So we are going to jump in. And today we are talking about building confidence to make a significant life change. And so I'm incredibly excited today to be having this conversation, because I think many of you know my story, right? And you know the things that I have shared, that I learned about financial independence from my spouse, and then immediately, had a mental health crisis and really jumped into this slow-fi and lifestyle design stuff pretty quickly. So I'm excited to have Corey on, because I think of the two of us, Corey is the more risk-averse person and was the person who was more into the traditional financial independence, retire early approach, sort of long before I was. And I feel really lucky that he was into that, sort of from an early place, so that by the time I learned about it, we were in a fairly good financial position to be able to start making some life changes. So we're going to get into all of that. But what I'm most excited about is that I think if you're struggling to make some sort of life change, I feel like Corey is going to have a lot of insights to share about the transition that he made and the mental shifts that needed to happen over the last few years to go from, working in the C-suite in a job that you'd been at for 10 years to, even a year and a half, 2 years ago, thinking I would be happy working, in a traditional job full-time for another 5 years, to getting to a place where a year and a half to 2 years from that point, you were quitting and now are taking 6 to 12 months off, completely off of work before figuring out what you want to do next. So yeah, so welcome to Corey. Excited to have you here today.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome. So one thing that I always do for all of these events, and if you have attended any of these conversations, you'll know that I always ask people to commit to taking some sort of action coming out of these events. Because I know that when we are just passively participating and like passively taking in information, we listen differently than if we're thinking, okay, what am I taking away from this? What action do I want to take as a result? Okay, and so that's how I want you to be participating today, is focusing on, okay, what is the thing I'm taking away? What action can I take as a result of what I'm learning? And I'm actually going to ask you at the end to share some of those things that you're learning and the actions that you're going to take. And so actually what I want to do right now is quickly turn to the comments here. And I want to hear from you if you will commit to taking some sort of action as a result of today's conversation. And so I want to be seen. I usually see yeses and absolutelys and pinky promises. And that's what I want to see in the chat before we jump in. Okay. Okay, awesome. We're starting to see some yeses. I don't see pinky promises yet, but I'm sure that we will get there. We have a heck yes from Lucy. Okay, awesome. Okay, so we're going to dig into a few different things here, right? So building confidence to make a specific change, from learning about financial independence to embracing slow-fi, and then strategies to work through our fears. Okay, so Corey, I would love to sort of start off here by having you share with everyone, how did you originally learn about financial independence in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So I learned of financial independence back in 2012, so pretty early on, from some of the early financial independence retire early bloggers. So names like Mr. Money Mustache, Mad Fientist, even Retire by 40, Early Retirement Extreme, a few others I'm sure that I'm forgetting. And so when I first learned of FI through these bloggers, it's funny, I didn't even consider myself part of the FI community. And the reason being is that the narratives at the time were a little bit different than my story, than our story. And the narratives that I was hearing was working for a nonprofit or contributing to a charity was something that people did after they reached financial independence. And yet, as many of you know, I was working in the nonprofit sector and did for the bulk of my career. And so it seemed to disqualify me, and like in my own head, that by working for a nonprofit, it was different than the narratives. And so I didn't consider myself part of the FI community, but was still obsessed with personal finance and digesting the information and the key themes and ideas. And so I think over time, that thought process evolved. And of course, now in the present, I look back on that thinking that was absolutely absurd. And it took me probably a few years to really deepen my understanding of financial independence to really change that belief. And I think as I look back on it now, that's probably a big part of the reason why we have really focused on sharing other people's story on the blog and YouTube channel, because there are so many different paths to financial independence. And often those that were highlighted early on didn't resonate with a lot of people. I know that's true for myself. And so sometimes it just takes hearing many different stories to really say, hey, wait, this could be for me. And I could actually pursue financial independence and build a life that I love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you were talking, I was actually thinking, like, how many people here, right, at this meetup are hearing this and thinking, I learned about FIRE and felt like I didn't fit that narrative. If that is you can feel free to drop a comment below and let us know that. But I think that's something that we heard just constantly from people. And I felt a very similar way. That's like, well, I don't have this super high income tech job that's going to allow me to reach financial independence in 5 years or something, right? And so does this work, right? Does this work for me? Yeah, so, okay, so then to sort of fill in our story, then there was a period of time, right, where you were like, okay, this FI thing does work for us, where you were like pretty gung-ho about increasing our savings rate, and like that you were sort of all about the sort of FIRE path. Do you want to talk a little bit about like you went through that transition too?
Yeah, and I think it's funny because as I look back at it now, I don't think the idea was fully formed where I could articulate it, but at the time. But now I think what really appealed to me about the FIRE movement or financial independence was this idea of that a higher savings rate or building financial freedom or financial stability can provide that freedom, and it can be incremental. And so what I really latched onto was savings rate and just incrementally increasing it year after year. And so many of you have probably heard the story of how I first introduced Jess to FI, which was not really introducing her to FI, but more of like, hey, I was thinking about next year's finances. I think we should save 3 or 5% more than what we saved last year with absolutely no context, right? And it was just like, she was like, wait, what? Why would we do that? And it was just like, well, it's because we can. And, and so I didn't do the best job of articulating the why, lesson learned there. But this idea of incremental freedom or incremental financial freedom was something that really stuck with me and really was formative in those few years of just steadily increasing our savings rate. Of course, at the peak, we were saving 65%, but we didn't start there. It was probably 15 or 20%. But each year we would increase it, a few percentage points.
Yeah. So for those of you who haven't heard that story, I was introduced to financial independence by Corey on an annual basis, saying, let's save just 5% more. Let's save how about 5% more? And I just kept saying, like, but why? Like, what are we doing? Why are we doing that? I want to travel. I want to do, some of this other stuff. And, we got to a place where it was like, okay, we can save more and we can, improve our quality of life too. And so figuring out the right balance of that. And then I finally, got to a place where I was ready to say like, oh, like I don't necessarily want to work in a traditional job forever. So what could financial freedom provide for us?
And in case I didn't make it clear, I would not recommend that approach. And I think we'll get into what I would recommend later in this live, but just to make sure that's clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay. So I then when you introduced me to FIRE, I feel like I made the transition from FIRE to slow FI pretty quickly. But it took you a little bit of time. And so I would love, and as we said, like you tend to be the more risk averse of the two of us. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you actually then started to transition that mindset from the traditional FI, let's save as much as we possibly can, to a more slow FI approach.
Yeah, there's a difference between understanding and believing an idea and then putting that into practice in your life. And so while I definitely adhered to the philosophy of like we should enjoy the journey along the way, it was definitely a process to then put that into practice. And I think I made this transition very slowly over a number of years. And as I think about that journey and that evolution of thought, I think one of the inflection points that really stands out was when you, Jess, had to take a break from work, as you were mentioning at the beginning of this. And this is certainly something you've talked about countless times. But for those who don't know, Jess was forced to take a break from work after dealing with severe anxiety. And it was, I think, about 6 months of a break, if I'm remembering correctly. And so as the partner of someone who's going through this, there was no doubt in my mind that this was the best thing for her at the time, given what she was dealing with. And so that kind of forced me to reconcile these kind of seemingly competing um, beliefs, both that we should be saving aggressively towards financial independence and also building a life now along the path. And so practically, I got to see this play out when we went from 2 incomes to 1 or a little bit more than 1, because you were getting some long-term disability for a little bit. And so in fairness, it didn't change my approach to FI immediately. And there were still internal narratives in my head that were motivated probably largely by scarcity that really fueled this desire to save and build more financial freedom. And yet at the same time, started to see that we didn't need to save as much, right now, and that we could approach life differently without jeopardizing our future retirement or selves and lifestyles. And I think another really influential point along my journey, so there was that inflection point, but another element was really just learning about other people's stories and how they've approached their path to financial independence. So while we've featured SlowFi interviews on the blog for many years, those were as much for me as they were for the audience, right? I would read every one before we publish it. And it was very inspiring to see people making really intentional choices to live in the moment. And so I think it was a combination of both like putting this in practice, you stopping work and then eventually going back part-time, and then us realizing like, hey, we're saving just as much with you working part-time, that I really started to change my thought process. And I think, to a certain extent, that continued up until this past year when I was forced to then kind of wrestle with how long do I want to continue working, because that was yet another step in the direction of really embracing SlowFi. And I think, everyone along the journey, from what I've heard and everyone I've met, eventually gets to that point of asking themselves, what's the point, or when is enough type of thing. And hopefully everyone will have come to understand, as I have, that money is a tool and it's not the end goal, right? Sometimes we obsess so much about the money or how we're doing it and all the optimizations. I know that I've been guilty of this, and we lose sight of what the end goal is, that it's to build a life that we love and do things that we enjoy and value time more than possessions or money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that you said there strikes me as like, there's this process where there's like a bunch of small steps that happen that like, I think you used this analogy at one point that like sometimes making a change is actually more about like, like you're getting into like a really cold body of water, and what you're going to do first is dip your toe in, and then you might like step in and get like up to your ankles and like wait until you can handle that, and then you're going to go up to your knees and wait until you like feel good about that, and then go, sort of in a little bit further. And I think for us, like that's how our SlowFi journey has been, that our sort of like FI journey and the discovery of being able to use the financial freedom to build the lifestyle that we want to have, that it wasn't like I think of FIRE as this like immediate thing where you go from like saving 50% of your income to like immediately just switching and starting to spend on your nest egg, which like, as I'm talking about, I'm like, oh, that feels scary to do. And I can imagine why people get to the point where they're like, oh, well, I should probably just do one more year, or, because it's like, It's scary. It's like basically you're like, I'm diving in to this like really cold lake, from this like really high cliff, and I don't know, I don't know anything about what it's going to be like. Whereas like when with our approach, it seemed right. It was like I took the 6 months off. That was dipping our toe in, and then I started working part time, which was getting up to our ankles. And then, starting the business and quitting my job was like, let's get up to our knees, right? At this point into that slow-fi journey. So yeah, I want to sort of transition this because then we sort of kept going, right, into that slow-fi journey. Right. Some of that was, that sort of the next step after me quitting my job and running the business was keeping your income high but spending more, so reducing our savings rate by spending more and building out the camper van. And then now this year getting to the point where you actually decided to leave your job. So yeah, so I want to hear more. I want you to share more about that thought process. So 2 years ago, and we have a picture of these, like we were making these 5-year plans, and on one side of the board was my ideal, which was like Corey quits his job tomorrow, and we like hit the road, right? And his ideal, yeah, and his ideal on the other side of the whiteboard was working full time and having like life stay as it is for the next 5 years. And 2 years later, like a year and a half later, you made the decision to quit your job. 2 years later, you actually quit. And so I would love for you to share with folks like what changed for you and what motivated you to leave, so much earlier than your sort of original intention or plan.
It seems crazy that it was only a year and a half prior to me making that decision, but then I think that's probably the effect of COVID and kind of time feeling like it's much different than it actually is. But when we first made those plans, I think I probably wouldn't have admitted it at the time, but I was still thinking about what would be the most optimal financial scenario. And so it wasn't necessarily what's the thing that I want the most, but more of like, what's the best financial plan, And so how could we get to FI or close to FI as possible to eliminate as much of the risk of us taking a leap and kind of changing our employment approach. And so I think over time with additional safety nets, so with the business growing and covering a larger percentage of our expenses, it eliminated some of the risk. Of course, our financial position improved somewhat over the 2 years, just with 2 more years of savings. But I think the biggest change from me going from I want to work 5 more years to quitting was work just no longer became worth it. And that's because one, things changed at work that became less enjoyable and even less tolerable to some degree. And also at the same time, I was becoming more and more interested in trying out new hobbies like video editing and film production. And so while I was working, I didn't even have the mental energy to even commit any time to pursue them. I was just so burnt out. In fact, I remember setting a goal. Every year, I typically set a handful of goals personally. And I remember setting a goal for 2022 that was starting a YouTube channel. And while I did some research about YouTube and how to do it, and I was talking with some of my closest friends, I never got started. And I remember realizing last fall of 2022, that I had made no progress towards this goal. I hadn't even created a YouTube channel or anything that literally takes 5 minutes. And I had literally zero energy to even change that. I was just like, well, that's not happening this year. And so I think I reached this inflection point both because there was this push away from work and then also this pull that I just didn't have any energy to even commit any time to, where it just created this inflection point where it was like a no-brainer that I should quit. And that was, a combination, as I said, we had sufficient financial security where I could make a change without a concrete plan. Work became less enjoyable, and then there were other things I wanted to pursue. And so as I was thinking about it, it was just like, of course I should do this, even though it was really hard and challenging. It just became such a no-brainer for me. And so that's, I think, kind of how I got there over the few years.
Yeah, and so actually one thing that I heard you say that I want to dig into a little bit is this idea that there's an opportunity cost to staying, right? And so at first, when you had created that when we created the 5-year plans, you were thinking like, what's the most optimal thing to do financially, right? Whereas it then became more of a like, what's the most optimal thing to do in life, right? For the life that we want to be living. And how can I balance that sort of level of risk to, and actually, I don't, if anyone here follows us on Instagram, I posted a quote today on Instagram that was like, those who don't take risks, like risk more. But it just depends on the risk that you want to take and are willing to take, right? And so it sounds like for you that the focus was a lot on how do I mitigate the financial risk without necessarily thinking about or including like the trade-offs to what are the risks if I don't do this. And that sounds like that, was a transition that happened.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So I want to dig in. So I know one thing that people are probably really interested in hearing about is just what are some of the fears that came up for you? So when you were thinking about, right, last fall, when you were in this process of like, am I going to make this huge life change where I just completely quit my job of 10 years, and like what fears, limiting beliefs came up for you and how did you work through them?
Yeah, such a great question. I ended up, because I had this question in advance, I wrote out some of my fears ahead of time, and because there were quite a few. But I did limit it to, I think, 3 here. So I'm going to read through all of them first, and then I'll share more about how I worked through them. So the first one was that I was afraid we wouldn't make enough money to cover our expenses. So as many of you know, we are Coast-Fi, which means we don't have to save and invest another dollar for our traditional retirement, but we still have to cover our everyday expenses. Of course, we could pursue the idea of withdrawing a small percentage of our portfolio, but right now our approach has been, let's just cover our expenses. So I was afraid that we weren't going to make enough to cover our expenses. The second one was that I was afraid that I was making a mistake leaving my job. And that, I think, is just like intentionally vague, right? Like there are so many different sides to that, which I think there were many elements that were true in terms of like what I was afraid of. And then the third one was I was afraid that I would have to get another job at some point in the future, and that it would be a worse job than what I already had. And this is similar to kind of one of the myths I was talking about in one of the YouTube videos that I released several weeks ago, closer to when I had left my job, which was just built out of this scarcity mindset. And so in terms of how I approached and worked through the fears, there was probably a couple of different strategies. One was my more financial brain of being like, how can I mitigate the risk associated with all of these fears? And so, again, I talked about this in that same video, but we built up a large cash reserve as a safety net as one of the ways that we kind of mitigated some of those risks or fears. But I think the probably more important aspect of this is kind of working through the mental aspect of it, not just kind of logistically, how did we address this? And so what I tried to do, not sure this is the best strategy, but what I tried to do is I looked at each one logically, I guess I would say, to really assess how valid each one was. Asking kind of like, where's the proof for the evidence that I have for each one? And so, for example, let's take the first one. Like, I was afraid that we wouldn't make enough money to cover our expenses. And so then what I would do is I'd say, okay, what do I have to kind of support this? How much is the business raising right now versus our current expenses? What's the gap there? What would that mean that I have to raise or earn in future years? And what's been the trajectory of the business too, right? And so just asking for like, what evidence, what's the history, what are the data points that I have to help inform, one, how likely this is to happen, and then the other thing I would do with each of these fears is thinking about the worst case scenario too. And so, and of course, when I say worst case, I don't mean like end of the world, apocalyptic worst case scenario, but I mean like what's the most likely worst case, right? So what would be the most likely worst case that gap that we'd have to make up to cover our expenses in year 1 and 2 after me leaving my job? And how bad would that be, right? And so I don't remember exactly what I calculated for this one, but it was probably in like we might overspend by $30,000 a year. And it's like, okay, well, that's not a huge issue because we have 2 years of expenses saved. And so we have a long runway actually at that rate, you know? And so working through those worst case scenarios allowed me to realize these aren't that big of a deal. And so that was really helpful for me, and not only for the first one, but for all the fears as they were popping up. And I think through doing that, I was able to just kind of flip the script a little bit and start kind of repositioning them not as fears, but as like, I don't know, like really valuable statements of like, hey, or like things that would support me making this really bold decision. And so I was able to start focusing on, you know, what I could do and the possibilities and the potential, as opposed to just being held back with all these fears and insecurities.
Yeah, I think sometimes even like when we think through like, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? And then what would I actually do if that thing happened? Like sometimes that actually brings up new opportunities and ideas of ways to move forward. And like I feel like I always feel empowered when I think through, like for me, when I think through the worst case scenario, because I follow it through. Like it isn't like, oh my gosh, what if da da da. It's like, well, no, let's actually answer the question. Like, what if we like made $0 this year? You know, what if like business revenue went down to 0? What would we actually do? Right. And what would we actually do? We'd probably pull some money from our emergency savings, of course. And 2, we would figure out some ways to generate income, right? Whether that be, you know, and for me, one of the things that I like to do is have like a list of like, here's ways that we could generate income. Or create additional income streams if we needed to, you know, like what are some of the resources that we have? We could rent out our house while we travel. We could rent out our van while we are at home. Right? We could do work in the gig economy. We could do some freelance work, right? Like there's so, and you know, and so then I start to think about that and think like, oh, like I'm a pretty resourceful problem solver. And like, even if the worst thing happened, I feel like I could figure out what I would do in that situation. And like, I would still be okay at the end of it.
That actually reminded me. So I'm not the first one to have quit a job, right? And so I have many friends who I'd met online who have followed a similar trajectory, or at least they had already quit their job and pursued self-employment and other things. And I remember a number of people have said something that really has stuck with me. It's something, I'm paraphrasing now, but saying like their worst case scenario of having to go back and find another traditional job is their worst case, but in others people's cases, they're like every day, right? And so it was just kind of really empowering, and I'm butchering that kind of quote now, but this reality of like, that might be my worst case, but there's so much upside to this too. And if I didn't make this change, it would still be my everyday. And so it feels like a no-brainer again.
Yeah. And I think one thing that provides me with some confidence too is like the worst case scenario, yes, is like what just would be like everyday life for many people, or what would be everyday life if you didn't make the change, right? So getting a full-time job. But there's actually so many possibilities between where you currently are and getting another full-time job of ways to generate that income too. And so, yeah, that's one thing that provides me with a lot of confidence too. So I have one thing that I've heard you say a few times. I think you didn't include this here, but earlier on, so not most recently, but earlier on, I remember you saying, "Well, I don't think I'll be able to find another job that pays me as well later." And I know, right? So you often would say that, and my response was often, well, you don't need to get another job that pays you as much. Like you don't need to make that much. Like we're coast fi if we only need to cover our expenses. Like you don't need a job that pays you six figures. So that was my response to it. But I'm actually curious to hear, like, how did that thought process change for you? Since I imagine there's a lot of folks here who might have that same thought of like, what if I can't find another job that pays me as much?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think since leaving my job, I've come to realize that I found so much security in the income that I was earning, as opposed to other aspects of financial security, like our net worth and wealth that we had built. And so I think it's really strange. I think that's probably true for many of us, and I'd love to hear if that is true for anyone else who's watching. But I found it to be so comforting for some reason. I find this a little illogical now, but like looking back on it, but I found so much comfort in the bi-weekly check that I was getting, and not so much tied to the wealth that we had built up. And so, but now having left the job and not earned a paycheck for 5 or 6 months, I realized that there's so much more to financial security than a paycheck every 2 weeks or every month if you're paid monthly. And so I'm forgetting what question you asked now, but I think what really has stuck with me, or like I've learned since leaving my job, is just that it's okay to not have a steady income, or to not be as earning as much as humanly possible, and more focusing on happiness in day-to-day life. And so I think looking back at it now, like I I don't think I would want as high paying job, just because it comes with so much responsibility and time commitment. And for me now, it's more focused on quality of life and maximizing my time. And I'm sure we'll get into that too with later questions.
So Connie actually asked, like, if you did need to go back to work full time, like, how would you rationalize maybe needing to work full time but for less?
Hmm.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in a little bit here and then you can answer too. I think part of it was something you already just said, was like, you've realized that you actually wouldn't want to go back to work having the same level of responsibility and stress like on your shoulders. And so I think that's that, you know, that could potentially be part of it.
Yeah, I think if I were to have to go back to work, I think it would just be like more about admitting that like we need to earn some income to cover our expenses, but I don't know if I would even go back working full time, right? Like we're at a point with our in our path to FI that I would probably work part time or consult well before I had to work full time. It's yeah, so it's hard to even answer the question because I don't see myself ever going back to full time.
Right, right. Unless it's like absolutely necessary. And, you know, it actually makes me think of the conversation we were having a second ago about how there's a lot of ways that we could earn income before needing to go back and get a full-time job, right? That there's the consulting route, there's the freelance, there's the, you know, utilizing the assets that we have to generate income. And those things. And actually, there's one question. So Connie asked a follow-up question of like, would you be bored if you took an easier job?
Maybe. And so I think like if I were to find a more traditional job, whether it be part-time or full-time, and it were not as stressful, I think I would still want something that's really engaging and the work I enjoy. And so that was also a part that I didn't really touch on earlier is like part of the struggle is the day-to-day work that I was doing, I really enjoyed. So I was ops, which meant like finance, technology, HR. And so I enjoyed the strategy, the problem solving, the thinking creatively, the outside of the box. I loved that stuff that I did. I didn't like all of the bureaucracy and some of the drama that comes with working in a workplace and some of the other things just with my personal situation. But there may be aspects of being bored, but for me it's now it's no longer about like I'm being I identify with who I am when I'm working like a traditional job. Like so much more of what I am is outside of work now. And I think that, and I saw a question earlier in the chat about like yeah, professional. Thank you, Jess, for pulling that up. How coped, and that's, you know, it's still a work in progress of really letting go of that professional identity. But even if I were bored in another traditional job, like that's okay because I'm getting so much more fulfillment from what I'm doing, traveling and pursuing other interests. That would be fine for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, so speaking from the experience of going from working full time in a really intense job that required all of my mental energy to taking time off and then going back to work and choosing like an easy job that was just like a piece of cake for me. Like it was like a step below my capabilities and I could just like do it in my sleep and it was amazing and it let me focus on like everything that I wanted to do outside of work. And to sort of let go of that professional identity as being the main thing, like I mean, and like who I am, right? I'm so much more than the work that I do.
And I think maybe there are different seasons too of life of where I worked a job where I was constantly being pushed to learn new things and pushed to the limits, and that was really enjoyable, but at the cost of not having any much energy outside of work. And so, right, I would get home from work and I would just want to veg out for a little bit or not have the energy to do other interests like, you know, starting the YouTube channel. So I think now I'm in a different season of life and I value other things differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm trying to find a question. Oh, okay. So right now, so transitioning here, let me go back. So transitioning here, so you've now been on a sabbatical for about 6 months, right? You've been, and we don't necessarily need to get into these exact questions, But I think the one question that came up in the chat was like, how much money is actually needed to take a year off? I found it. Like, how much money would you say is actually needed to take a year off?
That's a good question. I mean, I would love to hear what other people think. I think this is different for everyone. And it really depends on your situation. For me and for our situation, I think we have more than enough. And right, and that gets to being really risk averse, as Jess was talking about earlier in this call. And so I think I'm not sure if I'm the best person to ask that, because I would probably give you a much larger number or approach than many other people who have taken the leap of faith and been perfectly fine. And so I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's my initial reaction to it.
Yeah, no, it's actually a great question, because I would say my first reaction to that of like, how much do you actually need to take a year off? My first question would be, are you truly taking the time off and not working at all? I think a lot of times people think like, oh, I'm going to take a year off. But then they end up still doing like a little bit of work. So for example, I have a client right now who decided to take a sabbatical, and he's taking 15 months off of work. And his work actually offered him to do consulting work, but like only as much as he wanted to. Right. And so for him, he's like experimenting with like, could he do 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week of work and still have this like sabbatical experience that he wants to have. Right. And so I guess one question would be, are you taking the year fully off and doing no work during the year and generating no income? If so, then I would say you would want to have your full year of expenses, right? And then probably 6 months in addition to that of a runway to help you to figure out what you want to do next. Unless you're gonna, start that 6 months into your year off, if that makes sense. If you're wanting to, be back to working at that point in time. But if you are planning to generate a little bit of income, it could be less. And I've certainly seen people who, like we're talking about doing this in the absolute best case scenarios, right? Like coast-fi and have your FU money and your cash reserves and all of this. Whereas like there are so many people who leave jobs because they're completely intolerable, right? And they may have, 3 months of severance, right? Or they could get unemployment for a period of time, right? And they're turning around and figuring it out, right? And they are working in the gig economy or starting a business to, do some work on the side while they figure out, the long-term things that they want to do. And so, yeah, so I would say like, if you don't want to work at all, you probably need a year's worth of expenses. And then maybe a little bit extra as a buffer. But if you're able to work, and if you are going to do that during, if you're able to do any work during that time and you want to do any work during that time, then that reduces it.
And there are people in the chat or in the comments who are also responding. Carrie said something very similarly, where your annual expenses plus a buffer. Other people are saying it would depend on your expenses and income, as you were mentioning, Jess, as well.
Yep. Yeah. And I think Nikki says like cash reserves, not investments. And I think, so I have a good friend who's currently living a semi-retired lifestyle. And sometimes she feels like, like she needs to be doing more, right? But but she wants to be like spending time with her young kids during this season of life. Um, and I think that the thing that she tells herself is like, I'm 35 right now. Like there's so many people that are like in a place where they don't actually start to focus on their finances until their 40s or even their early 50s, and they turn, and it's harder, but they turn things around. So like if she happened to like spend down her entire portfolio, which is very likely not to happen, right? But like this is kind of starting to think through some of those worst case scenarios. Like what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is that she would start anew, like so many people do, and they do it. And so so I think sometimes like it's good to look at examples of people who you know are in are sort of coming to this space and coming to financial independence a little bit later, right? And to say, okay, well, I'm thinking of someone who's like, she started the blogger who's doing late starter fire, like she started in her late 40s, right? And that's completely possible to do, or I think of Michelle Jackson, who did a Slow Fight interview at one point where she decided to quit a job that was completely intolerable and did not know what her backup plan was at that given moment, and she was still in debt at that point, right? And for her, the financial security that she had was like 3 months of expenses to be able to like take time off to improve her mental health. And then she started to build up different income streams and freelance and work in the gig economy as she was figuring out the stuff that she wanted to be doing long term. And so I think, some of that is saying, like, are there, right? Like, I think some of it is looking at what are all the different ways that I could generate income? And can I generate income in ways that are more enjoyable and less stressful, that can allow me to live my life in a different way? And I think, Melissa, I hope that sort of slightly answers your question too, is how can people, do this who aren't yet to a place where they're coast-fi and not in the financial position that they want to be in yet, that we can grab hold of and utilize the financial freedom that we have, whatever that is, right, where we currently are. And so, it could be like, what benefits can we utilize in our work context? Or is there a way that I could, take time off or get an easier job for a period of time? Or right, I think there's so many different things that people can do, even if the thing is not, I'm able to not work entirely for a whole year. There's a lot of incremental like places in between that. Yeah. Okay. So we've gotten a few questions, and I think we've answered a few of them. One question I actually want to ask is, so you've been on your sabbatical now for like 6 months or so. What have you learned so far? And how has it changed? Like, how has what you've learned changed what your plans are post sabbatical?
Yeah, good question. In terms of what I've learned, I think there are kind of there are two big realizations. The first one is maybe kind of funny, but is that 6 months is not long enough. And so it's crazy to me that it's been almost 6 months. And when I left, it was more of like 6 to 9 months of a sabbatical, or I think we may have been saying 6 to 12 at some point too. But I know now that 6 months is not long enough, that I'm just really enjoying the time, free from the obligations and being able to pursue other interests, and that I'm not sure I'll ever want to go back to a traditional job, which I know Jess is like gung ho for, like cheering for that end result, but giving me the space to decide what I really want to do. So I think that's one thing, is like it's not a very long period of time. Although, like me from a year ago would probably be like, wow, 6 months is a really long time to take off from work. But it's not. Like there's things that I'm filling the time with, and I've really enjoyed it. And in terms of what I enjoy, like the other big realization is like really reflecting on the things that I do enjoy. And what I've learned is that I enjoy working towards bigger projects that require lots of planning and research and trying to like optimize it. So I think back to when we were planning to buy and build out our camper van, that I probably spent 500 hours doing research on the type of van, how long it would be, the various products that we would put into it, what would be the optimal layout. When I tell people this, they probably think I'm crazy. I don't know, but like I really enjoyed spending that much time and then seeing it come to fruition and come to life. There's something about that like bigger project and coming from an idea to bringing it to life that I really enjoy. And so I think as I'm considering what I'm doing next, like I know that's going to be a big part of it, and not just doing smaller one-off projects, but things that might take longer to develop or grow or do. And so that's something I've learned in my time.
Awesome. And then I think we can probably wrap up here soon. I think, wrap up with this question before, and everyone stick around because I'm going to ask you what you learned and what you're going to do as a result. But the last question I have for Corey is just for someone who's in a situation where they're feeling like they have the golden handcuffs, like that they need to like continue working in, you know, this like high income, stressful, like, you know, what advice do you have for people who are in a similar situation?
Yeah, I think it probably sounds a little bit cliche, but I think my advice would be to surround yourself with people who are making similar life choices. And that can take different forms. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but maybe not to the extent. But like my transition was really challenging, and I gave a long notice at my job. I gave them 4 months, and so that was a long period in and of itself. And then I've had 5 or 6 months since then. And we talked a little bit about like separating the identity from work, and even the decision to quit. Like there was a lot about just like leaving that former part of me. And what made it easier was really getting to know other people who have made similar decisions, and even meeting people for the first time who would give me positive affirmations. Like when I quit my job about 3 weeks after, when we just started our van trip, I went to Economy in Cincinnati. And at the point, like when I was going there, I was a little nervous just because it was like so new to have left my job. But I'm so glad that we went, because it was so beneficial. Just all the positive affirmations, the people who encouraged me, who just met me like 2 minutes before when I told them I had left my job. It just gave me so much comfort knowing that there's a different path. And sometimes when you're heads down in a W-2 job, you don't always see those alternate paths. And so I think it's both for the encouragement, but also just to see that there's other possibilities out there. So that would be my advice for someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing that you can do if you're thinking like, oh, I don't have people in my life yet. One thing that you can start doing is, I think on our website, we have like over 60 Slow-Fi interviews at this point. So you can start to like understand the stories of people. And then would definitely encourage you to try to come to some kind of like live event, whether that be Economy or a Camp Fi or one of our Slow-Fi retreats in the future, to start surrounding yourself with people who are supportive of living, and making unconventional life choices. So yeah, that's great advice. Okay, so what I want to do now, actually, we still have a bunch of people on here, which is awesome. I actually want to turn to the chat, and I want you to take a second and tell us, what did you learn from the discussion today, and what action will you take as a result? And we'll give you a second there. And Corey, you think about what you learned from this conversation too, because I'm going to ask you, and I will also. So what did we learn from this conversation, and what action will we take as a result?
And while you're thinking, I saw earlier in the chat someone promoting this. If you can hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. This is the selfless, I don't know, what's the word? Promotion.
The self-promo?
Yeah. But definitely means a lot to us. If you guys are enjoying this, getting value out of it, if you could hit that like button, really appreciate it.
Awesome. So I see Nikki saying that she's going to calculate her base expenses and learn that that's possible. Awesome.
I mean, my takeaway is that I'm not alone in the feeling of getting security from income. I saw a couple of people respond to that prompt earlier, and I think that's comforting, right? And just knowing that we're all on this path of really understanding where we find comfort and being able to change that over time too.
Awesome. Yeah, and I hear Melissa is the importance of connecting with others and making those same choices. Yeah, Mike says schedule another one-on-one chat with you, Corey. Yeah,
Anytime.
definitely, yep. Mike. Connie talking to her husband about ways to generate income if you were to quit. Confronting the fears one by one. Yeah, that one's really important. John, the philosopher, before you can face a new opportunity, you must face yourself. I don't know who Potato is, but I kind of love that it's Potato, smiley face with heart eyes, surrounding yourself with similar people with similar situations. And then
I think it's Jenny. I think Jenny earlier had mentioned children changing the name to Potato. Please tell me if I'm wrong there, Jenny, but I believe it was Jenny.
I love that. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Really appreciate all of you being here and having the opportunity to talk through how to make challenging, significant life changes and get support, ideas, encouragement, and have the opportunity to hopefully provide some motivation and inspiration as you move forward on your journey. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon.